Hello everybody, welcome back to Glaciers and Glacial Geomorphology. So we're at the beginning of step 5, and having completed 4 steps, we're at a point where it's probably worth looking back, reviewing what we've done, and just making sure that this conceptual map of the course that I asked you to be working on as we work through the stages is clear in your mind. It's important that you know how everything we're doing fits together. This module isn't a bunch of different things that you need to memorise separately and then regurgitate in an exam. It isn't working that way at all. This module is a connected set of material that you need to understand as a unit. You need to see the connections between things. And in the assessment at the end of the module, as well as in your coursework essay, it's those connections that we're interested in exploring. So I asked you right at the beginning of the module to gradually build up, whitewash a wall of your bedroom and gradually paint onto it all the items that we're covering and the connections between them. But I just want to check that you have that kind of map developing either in your mind or on a piece of paper or on your bedroom wall so that you're seeing these connections. So we started looking at the big global system. That was our starting point. So the big global environmental system. And as part of that, we talked about the hydrological cycle. So the global system and the hydrological cycle. And as part of that hydrological cycle, we identified mass balance as an important starting point for our glacier story. And as part of the whole mass balance story, we recognised the formation of glaciers. And we're seeing glaciers here in the context of that global hydrological cycle. Now, also related to things to do with the mass balance, that formation of glaciers also led us to talk about the characteristics of ice itself. So the characteristics of ice itself, including things like the crystal structure, the vein boundary, the atomic structure of ice. And also, within that, we talked about stable isotope glaciology. Stable isotopes, fractionation, delta oxygen 18, delta deuterium, all those kinds of things. So we've got a connected set of material here that's linking the big global picture, the hydrological cycle, right down to the tiny scale of the isotopic composition of the ice, and tying that in with the formation of glaciers, the growth and decay of glaciers through mass balance, connecting to the characteristics of ice, including the crystal structure, and so on and so forth. Now, when we were looking at the crystal structure, we also said a little bit about the relationship between stress and strain, or the mechanical response, if you like, of ice to an applied stress. And that got us talking in a general way about a really important topic: movement, the movement of glaciers. And when we were talking about movement, obviously you got to understand all about creep, you got to understand all about sliding, and you got to understand all about subglacial deformation. And we got lots of detail in there. So for example, when we were talking about sliding, we talked about regelation, we talked about enhanced basal creep, lots of different subtopics, if you like, or bits of detail as you look at each one of those particular mechanisms. Now, looking at those mechanisms and thinking about motion kind of raised for us a number of issues that we need to look at in more detail, because they are the issues that control those movement processes. And I said earlier on that movement is going to become a really important theme in this module as we head down the page, if you like, or down the module, as we move towards the final part of the module where we're talking about geomorphology, glacial landforms and landscapes. A lot of glacier geomorphology is completely dependent on things to do with glacier motion. And I often argue at this stage in the module, or I might change my mind later on when we talk about other topics, but for now I'm going to say that movement belongs right at the heart of our conceptual map of the glaciers and landscapes module environment, if you want to think of it that way. So we identified, when talking about creep, sliding, substrate deformation, all sorts of different controlling factors. On one hand, we have things like the driving stress, and we have the resistance there, but things like friction, cohesion of a subglacial sediment. And we began to recognise that that resistance, for example, and to some extent the driving stress, is dependent on things like, certainly the relationship between the driving stress and the resistance is dependent on things like temperature. Partly because temperature affects the characteristics of the ice, A in Glenn's flow law, for example, but also because temperature controls hydrology, and hydrology is related to friction for sliding at the base, and it's related, for example, to pore water pressure in the substrate underneath the glacier. So temperature, hydrology, interconnected, driving or controlling that relationship between the driving forces and the resisting stresses. So some of these things we've looked at already in some detail, but others, such as glacier temperature and glacier hydrology, we haven't really said very much about yet. Also, when thinking about movement, we've talked about the mechanisms, but we haven't yet said very much about the actual outcomes or the results of those mechanisms and the way that real glaciers are actually moving. How fast does a glacier go? We haven't really talked about that. So another topic that we just need to pause for a moment and say a few words about are the differences between what are often referred to as normal, fast and surge flowing glaciers. Different glaciers work in different ways or respond in different ways to all this material that we've been talking about there. That leads to a certain set, put those in red as well because that's what we're coming on to, a certain set of styles of glacier motion that we just need to be aware of. Now, like I said in your introductory material for this stage of the module, this step of the module, I don't want to get bogged down in these things because I want to move on to these links in here between movement and geomorphology. And that's going to lead to us talking, for example, about ice bed interactions, things that are happening at the bottom of the glacier where the glacier is in contact with the substrate underneath it. That's where most geomorphic processes that lead to landform development, that's where we can start exploring those in some detail. Now at this stage I'm just scribbling out a map of my own, but this is my version. You need your own version, and when you look at your own version, which hopefully will be neater than this one, try to identify other things that you think maybe we've missed or things that you think we ought to be emphasising more. And my guess is that one thing that will occur to you is that, well, we've talked about mass balance and the formation of glaciers and how glaciers move, but we've kind of skipped another topic as well. In our enthusiasm to cover this main thread of the core of the module, there's another topic that we've missed that could be relevant to some of this material, and that's the idea of glacier fluctuations. We've talked about the ice moving through a glacier, but we haven't talked about that advance and retreat of glacier margins. Now, for now, I'm just going to put this up here. I'm going to put a red ring around it because I am going to say something about it for you this week. But at this stage I want you to think, where does that belong on our map? Does it connect to that? Does it connect to all of this? Does it connect to this? Does it connect to that? Where do we put that? And so I've deliberately given you, I hope, a fairly messy map of what we've done so far, because I'm not trying to lay it out for you in an exact structure. I'm just trying to remind you that you can tie these things together, and your mission right now, right at the beginning of step 5, before we even move into step 5, is just to go back, look at everything we've done so far, try to make some kind of a map of your own of how everything hangs together, and start putting big arrows through this map. So, I mean, for me, I'm kind of trying to draw one big arrow that runs through the whole lot. And I'm saying, well, we started with the big global system. We talked about how glaciers work and how they move and how they operate at the bed and how they affect geomorphology. And look, here's glacial landforms, and you can use glacial landforms to reconstruct characteristics of the nature of the glaciers that created them. That's kind of the way I set this module up for you right at the beginning of the module. And so I have a theme or a thread in my mind as I'm organising the sessions into a particular structure. You need, for your own particular interests in the subject, your own essay that you're writing, for example, you need to organise your own thread, your own set of connections between the different parts of the module. And that's what you should be doing right now before we move on. And during this step 5, I'm going to say a little bit about normal, fast and surge flow. I'm going to say a little bit about glacier fluctuations, and then as we move forward into step 6 and 7, I'm going to talk a lot more about the ice bed interface and the structure of glaciers that leads us to consider what's happening right at the bottom of the glacier. And I'm also going to say more about temperature and hydrology. So these sections are still to come. Today, or this week, we're talking about normal fast and surge flow and glacier fluctuations. As always, I'm going to give you some very basic reading from my old textbook that will give you the starter material, but it's really important that you follow this up with more recent and more advanced readings from the journals. What's in the textbook is designed to be very much in line with the level and the structure and the thinking behind this module, but it's getting to be quite an old book now, and it is important that you read up the more recent material. For example, when you've read up on glacier surging, if you want to follow that material up with your own independent reading, there's a lot of recent work emerging on glacier surging, for example work by Doug Benn and his colleagues, and it's really important if you are reading up on surging, you read up on that recent, up-to-date material, as well as looking at the basic standard texts, which are inevitably a few years behind the cutting edge of research, and you need to be right up there at the cutting edge of glacial and glacial geomorphological research.